Okay, good morning, comrades. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, brilliant. Welcome everyone to this, what I believe is a really, really important event. Social security is a trade union issue. My name is Martin Kavanagh. I'm one of the PCS DWP Group Vice Presidents, and I'm really pleased to be chairing today's morning session. And I hope everyone is ready for not only a really good set of engagement around the whole issue about social security, why it matters to trade unions and trade unionists, but also with some ideas for the workshops later on about what we can do to not only change the narrative on social security, but also to come up with some fresh campaigning ideas about what we can do to deliver a change in narrative, and perhaps more importantly, put real leverage on whatever government we have to make sure that for the first time in my lifetime, I believe, we have a government that actually prioritises social security as a proper, genuine safety net for those who need it. So today's session is going to be really, I think, fruitful, but also quite intense. We've got an awful lot to get through in a relatively short space of time. So we're splitting it really into 3 sessions. The first session is going to be an opening into the event today, and I'm going to hand over to Fran Heathcote, PCS General Secretary, to do that opening introduction. We're then going to move into a panel discussion with people on the top table, and then there'll be a chance for question and answers after that. And then this afternoon, or just before lunch and then after lunch, we'll be moving into workshops and rooms are dotted around the various places in the building. And I'll come on to that later on in terms of give you a direction, etc., but also tell you where we're at with the workshops. We know we've had some sort of last-minute dropouts and cancellations this morning, unfortunately, due to either health reasons or travel difficulties, but I think we've still got a good number of people to hopefully make today a really successful event. Just before I hand over to Fran, just a couple of sort of practical notices. In terms of the loos, then if people haven't already noticed them, then if you go out the door, turn left, then there are toilets there. There's an accessible toilet on the ground floor as well, accessible by the lift. So again, please make use of that. If there's no tests planned today, fire tests, so if the alarm goes off, it is the real thing. So the fire exits are either side to my right and left behind this building. We go down the stairs and then we meet in Mitchell Court, which is directly behind the car park behind this building. And there's also a comment board downstairs in the ground floor.
That's right.
Yeah, and near the desk on the ground floor, there's a comments board where people can encourage actually to write comments, preferably ones that aren't abusive, but write comments in terms of how you found the event, how you found the day, and any ideas that you may have about taking this really important issue forward. So without further ado then, we're going to move into our first session, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the General Secretary of PCS, Fran Heathcote. Fran is the first woman General Secretary. Fran's the first woman General Secretary of my union, PCS, and is a brilliant activist. She's a former DWP Group President, as well as former National President of the union. Has previously worked in DSS, DHSS, most of her working life when she wasn't riding racehorses for a living. But Fran is an absolute activist at heart. She's a stalwart of our movement, but it's also, she's steeped in social security. So Fran, a warm welcome.
Thanks, Martin. I still didn't start my speech. I was going to talk all about riding the racehorses in the West Country. No, I wasn't. I did start out working for what's then the DHSS in the West Country here in Somerset, and I think branches now even in Somerset. But as a former DWP worker and as General Secretary of PCS, the union that represents the workers in the DWP, it really does give me great pleasure to welcome you all to this meeting on social security. So for many years now, PCS has been working with DPAC, Disabled People Against the Cuts, and Unite Community, both in order to resist cuts to social security under successive governments, but also to put forward an alternative based on a fair system of what that would look like. We work on the basis that this is an area where there's a huge potential for division, but if we set benefit claimant against worker, if we set private sector against the public sector, if we set people up against each other, then only the government and employers profit from that. So the more solidarity we can muster, the more working together we can do, the better all of this is. And at the end of last year, we worked together to defeat the government's attacks on the personal independence payments. And I think we should all give ourselves a bit of credit for that, because that was an attack that would have taken thousands of pounds out of the pockets of disabled people, including thousands of PCS members, because members of PCS administer the social security system, but they rely on it as well. And when I was DWP president, one of the stats I used to use a lot was that 40% of those delivering social security benefits were also in receipt of them, and that was because of in-work benefits for low-paid workers. And thousands of our members claim universal credit in order to top up low pay. Tens of thousands will receive child benefit, and thousands claim disability benefits like the personal independence payment. So we have members over the state pension age who will be claiming their basic state pension, and thousands more who are looking forward to that day. Some claim carers allowance, and many live in households where others claim benefits. And that is why social security is a trade union issue. It's not just an industrial issue for our members in the DWP. So I've been going to the TUC now, well, I'm giving my age away, but probably about 30 years. And at that TUC Congress, we carry motions unanimously about joint working on social security and how it's an issue for all unions. But of course, you know, it's one thing carrying it, and it's another making it a reality. And we always try to look at what a better system would look like, what would a fairer system look like. So a lot of today hopefully will be to progress that debate. We should be really proud of social security though. The purpose of the welfare state is to reduce poverty, to reduce homelessness and ill health, and to empower people to live more independent and fulfilling lives. But that is not the tenor of the debate around social security. Firstly, benefits are still too low, workers too under-resourced, and job centres too understaffed in order to achieve those aims. And secondly, the social security system is under attack from this government, the official opposition, and from the party that is currently leading the polls reform. We as a country spend less than most other countries on our social security system, and I want to give you just two examples. So, unemployed workers in countries such as Ireland, France and Germany are entitled to more than double what UK workers get if they become unemployed. We have one of the least generous unemployment benefits of all of the advanced nations. The UK spends less than other comparable countries on pensions, with only 5.7% of UK GDP going on pensions compared to 10.4% in Germany, 13.9% in France and 16% in Italy. We have the least generous basic state pension in Europe. But if you read some of the media, you would think it was very different, wouldn't you? And I mean, we've moved on a bit, but if you think back 10, 15 years, there was a lot of media coverage around people like, if you recall, the series on Channel 4 about White D, and it was all about a woman who claimed benefits, and it was sort of ridiculing her, really making her a figure of fun because she had the audacity to use the state benefit system. But our members themselves are under-resourced. Last year, a National Audit Office report found that DWP had reduced the level of support it offers to UC claimants due to a shortage of available work coaches in job centres, and the NAO estimated that there was a shortage of 2,000 work coaches across the job centre network. We think that figure is much higher, but unemployment has increased since then, so the shortage has probably got worse. In PCS, we always try to articulate not just what we don't want to see, but what would be a good alternative and what would be a workable alternative. We do that working with the people that deliver the services, but also working with people we can join up and campaign alongside. So the strength of a lot of what we do here today, it comes from that sort of ethos that don't just complain about what's in place, talk about how you would want to change it and what would be a workable system. So we've done that on social security, we did it on austerity, tax justice and immigration, and we relaunched social security, tax justice and immigration last year as a way of putting pressure on the government to say, this is the current system, this is how we think it could be better, and you work with people to try and bring that about. So one of our things about our social security pamphlet, one of the things it does is to bust the myths about social security, because too often those attacking social security do so from a position of dishonesty. We keep hearing, don't we, that the benefits bill is spiralling, and frankly that's a lie. UK spending on social security has been flat for the last 15 years, and it is forecast by the OBR to remain flat in the future too. So even the 5-year forecast shows no increase in spending in this area. But when they came to PIP last year, they kept saying those who can work should work. Yet PIP is not an out-of-work benefit. Many of our members claim PIP, and for many of them, it's only because they receive PIP that they can work at all. So you have to look at what the impact would be of some of these announcements that are made. But whilst we've seen off the attacks on the winter fuel payment and on PIP, there are cuts to the health element of universal credit and to the Motability scheme that have gone through. And we know that some in this Labour government want to come back for more. We've just made a submission to the Timms review, and we have to stand ready to campaign again. And that means all of us working together, united and in solidarity in defence of social security. So, just to close, back in 2015, when I was DWP president, we launched a joint social security conference in Birmingham, alongside DPAC, alongside the Unite community, where we all came together. And so 11 years later, it's great to be asked to open the event today, and I really hope that we can continue this dialogue and put all of the words in the pamphlet into reality about how we take our campaign activity forward. And I think there's a really excellent programme of speakers over the course of the day, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. But finally, it just gives me great pleasure to hand over to a great friend of mine in our campaign, Martin Kavanagh, the Deputy President of the DWP and PCS, who's going to chair the opening panel. But a lot of you will know Martin and know that he's been a tireless campaigner in this area of work. So thank you very much for having me along. Thank you for allowing me to open the event today. It is a bit sort of full circle, because as I say, back in 2015 when we did this the first time, hopefully we can continue this dialogue and we can move on from where we've been before. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks for your time. Enjoy it.
Thanks very much, Fran, for setting that scene, and I agree with you, it's a really important day. In many respects, it's a shame that it's 11 years later after that event in Birmingham that we're still having to hold events like this, because whilst there is a change in the union movement, certainly, then clearly the narrative has not changed anywhere sufficiently enough, either within the trade union movement or indeed wider society. And sadly as well, I think people would agree that more and more now the working class in general are buying into the narrative of skivers and scroungers, and that is something that we as a movement absolutely have to be ready to challenge and tackle head on. So without further ado then, we are going to move into our opening panel session, and I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn. Just really to set the scene for this, the point of this panel is obviously to hear from 4 what I would call experts in the field, whether they're trade unionists, whether they're campaigners and community campaigners, or whether they're, like Charlene, who's been doing some fantastic work. Myself, Andy, Angela and Charlene attended an event in Manchester about 3 years ago now, yeah, I think it was. Yeah. And the work that we were doing jointly then to try and really build up the profile of the importance of the subject of social security, but why it's such an important issue for the trade unions, I think was high on the agenda then, and this is part of that ongoing campaign. So really just to set the scene, the purpose of this panel, as I say, is to hear from the experts in terms of some ideas that they have about how we can take this campaign forward, but then there will be an opportunity for questions and comments later on. We have already been given some comments from people in the audience, and including people who've not been able to get here today, unfortunately, because they've had to cancel at the last minute. But there are some pre-questions that we've been given that I'll allocate to the panel when we come to it. But really, this is all about getting ideas and having a discussion and starting the debate ahead of your workshops this afternoon. And the one thing I would just want to say is, Fran mentioned the fact that the TUC has policies on social security. I mean, genuinely, although it is 11 years since we had that first big conference, joint conference in Birmingham, it's also true to say that even after that big conference, then the item of social security was very, very rarely on the TUC agenda. And if we ever did have motions put forward to the TUC conference, then almost certainly we know that they would have been put there by PCS and no other trade union. And we also know that 90% of the delegates in that conference switched off, they weren't engaging in the subject matter. I have to say that is not the case now. And I don't think it's in any small part to the fantastic campaigning work that we've got at the organisations of pulling this event together today about driving that narrative within the TUC. But I think we also have to acknowledge as well that the one thing, or one of the great things that came from the pandemic, as traumatic as that was, for millions and millions of people, and sadly created devastation and huge loss during that time, it actually did throw people into the benefit system in a way that perhaps we've never seen before as a society. Overnight, people who never dreamed of having to claim benefits were plunged into that benefit trap, and I think that made unions started to sit up and take notice a little bit more than perhaps they had previously. So this is a really important event, but I'm sure everyone is going to get a great deal from it. So it gives me great pleasure then to introduce our first speaker, who is Charlene Ferrugia. Charlene is a doctoral researcher based in the Centre for Decent Work and Productivity in the Manchester Metropolitan University, and she's held roles in the criminal justice system, family violence sector, third sector, and in local government. But through Charlene's PhD, she's exploring the role of trade unions in the UK welfare system, and has also worked as a senior research assistant on the ASRC funded project Universal Credit and Employers, exploring the demand side of UK active labour market. Charlene, over to you.
Thank you for having me. As Martin said, I co-hosted an event with my supervisor who had undertaken quite a significant research project with employers and universal credit and the issues that were coming up for employers in the benefit system. And as part of that, some trade unionists were interviewed, and I sort of took over the reins in terms of looking at how trade unions have come across the policy, engaged with the policy, and represented on behalf of people claiming the benefit. So I'm in the final throes of writing up the thesis, so I feel like it's a really good point to share some of the discussions that I'm putting into my discussion chapter around what I've found in the research project. And yeah, it's kept me really engaged. It's been fascinating, and I hope going forward it's of some use to trade unions, that I can keep working with trade unions in terms of how we can work together to better represent low-paid workers. And I'll start with that. My thesis particularly focuses on low-paid female in-work claimants, so not unemployed as such, but those that are in work and claiming universal credit. So just to start, the first slide here. A lot of the stuff I say today is probably stuff you already know, so I'm sorry but for the purpose of going through my research, I just thought it would be good to just recap so that just in case there's anyone that doesn't know, we're all kind of on the same page. So the policy intent of universal credit, as per the government's rhetoric, was to reduce the number of workless households, to sort of make work pay by reducing benefit reliance, and to provide a more simplified benefit system. So as we can see on the table to the left of the screen, they've sort of merged single benefits into a one benefit system, so to speak. So 6 legacy benefits into a one benefit system. The policy has an inbuilt taper rate, so depending on earnings, income gets tapered back from universal credit depending on how much you earn. So if you earn more, your universal credit gets deducted. It's a monthly paid benefit. It's paid to the individual as opposed to the household, or as a household benefit. And as you would know, the sort of turn in policy development, which is quite significant and unprecedented, the UK are leading on punishing social policies, unfortunately, is that people that are in work are now subject to the same conditional requirements and sanctions as those that are traditionally being the unemployed. So if you're working in low-paid work and you don't fulfil the obligations that you have to sign up to through to gain eligibility for the benefit, if you don't sign up to those obligations and meet the conditional requirements, you can be sanctioned. So the reason that, partly because I'm an aspiring scholar that wants to work with women, but I'm interested in the policy because it has a gendered element to it. 57% of all claimants are women, But when we look at those that are being sanctioned or subject to conditional requirements, it's sort of double that of men. And the gender design features of the policy largely arrive around this assignment of a primary caregiver, which again is another sort of turn in the policy's development. But once upon a time, there used to be a 16-hour work threshold within claiming benefits, which kind of got absorbed once it became this single benefit. And so now there's a 35-hour week threshold, which for probably particularly single parents really push them into these conditional requirements that they once had some protection from, that the limit or the cap was 16 hours of work. Now it's expected that you'll work up to 35 hours a week. And with an increasingly precarious labour market and non-standard work on the rise, and women also disproportionately represented within that form of labour, and sometimes often working multiple contracts to fulfil the 35-hour requirement. You can imagine, I mean, that's sort of not a nice life. And also managing different contractual arrangements. Okay, so the sort of next slide looks at just the practicalities of the research I undertook, and I need to be quite strict with myself about ethics because I can't sort of disclose who I interviewed and what trade unions I interviewed, but I interviewed 5 very well-established trade unions, and I sort of chose unions that were representative of feminised sectors where there is inherently low-paid, precarious workers or women also working within those sectors, but also just trade unions that represented low-paid workers, because obviously I'm looking at low-paid workers, not people that are unemployed, so to speak, as claimants. I undertook 30 semi-structured interviews, and the people that I interviewed came from a breadth of the union. So we have community members, we have shop stewards, we have senior staff. So I really got, I feel I'm proud of it, a really rich data set with really good data. The aims of the research were to look at how trade unions have engaged with the policy, how this has influenced their representation in this policy space, and how effectively or effective some of the strategies have been, particularly when we think of low-paid women. And without going to the really abstract academic features of my research design, I took a position that just started from the notion that the welfare system is gendered. It's not gender neutral, and that kind of plays out in the labour market too, because labour markets are also not gender neutral. So there's this relationship between a gendered welfare state and low-paid work and insecure work in the labour market. And that kind of founds my research. And I think what's interesting is that it's two of the same problem. Low-paid work and benefit claiming are two in one of the same problem rather than two different problems. They kind of feed each other, so to speak. So the framework I used to analyse the data basically was a power, it's a power resource theory, it's called. So I used the concept of power to understand how trade unions represent what they're doing in terms of using different power resources. And I felt actually now, looking, it's been a really useful tool. And this models a renewed iteration of power resource theory. I think many years ago, in the 70s, there was one designed, I think basically on the first 3 power resources on the top there. Oh, no, sorry, ideational power has been added to the new iteration. I think that's the only one that's really been added, ideational power. But it's a new iteration of power resource theory. And basically, like I say, this is the part that you'll know more than me about. Institutional power is what resources trade unions can use as institutions to clout their weight. So if you get to talk to government, for instance, if they let you talk to them, that's a form of institutional power. So social dialogue's a form of institutional power. Structural power is obviously how you can disrupt production and how you can, so through disruption, through strikes, wage negotiations, improvements in pay is a form of structural power. Ideational power I find fascinating and is the new addition, but it's how we use ideas and thinking, how we frame things to understand and negotiate with power. So the same problem can be framed very differently. For instance, make work pay, using a benefit to make work pay, how that can be framed can be looked at from the point of in-work poverty, but it also can be looked at from the point of not relying on benefits, if you get what I mean. So it's the way we frame and create ideas about and use it to form power. It can also be things like how we use ideas to form alliances as well. So associational powers, you know, essentially just a crude version of that is how we associate with our members, how we mobilise people, how we engage people within the membership, and obviously coalitional powers, how we develop coalitions. So a lot of it's very self-explanatory. So the next slide looks at the key findings that I found. And it was really across the data set, which I wonder if this is unheard of, there was 100% consensus that universal credit was a trade union issue. And trade unionists had this really astute understanding, when I look at it against the literature and against this power resource theory, of two areas that the policy is affecting. So it's very much affecting the structural position, the structural power of workers, because obviously they have less of a position to disrupt because it's weakening their power in terms of how they can disrupt, and people just living on the borderline of, you know, not wanting to disrupt basically because they're just surviving in their circumstances. So it's really affecting the structural power of workers. Also with income precarity, that affects structural power. But it also is affecting the institutional power of trade unions. And those two sort of power resources are very much interconnected, obviously. If you've got a weakened membership, you've got a weakened trade union. But also too, there's things that have been happening around the policy, trade unions being attacked institutionally through statutory legislation that was put in place. That's kind of also contributed to the weakening of the institutional power of trade unions. And things like a lack of political will from governments to talk with trade unions about welfare reform. So, yeah, it was really consolidated from the responses that I got, that there were two forms of power that were being inhibited. So that kind of informed the second finding, which was this is exactly why trade unions have an interest in this policy, for those two reasons, that it's affecting institutional power and affecting the structural power of workers. However, when I sort of ploughed into the data and I applied the kind of lens where I looked at low-paid female workers, some contradictions sort of came up in the data where the interests of female workers sort of misaligned with trade union interest, even though they align also very well, because women as in-work claimants, their structural power, because they're structurally more disadvantaged in the system before any action is taken, they're already coming from a disadvantaged position. So in a sense, their interest is to improve their structural power, and obviously if they've got a stronger trade union, that's in their interest as well. But the contradictions just lied in some of the strategies that trade unions were using in this policy space. And I guess what's important about the conceptual framework that I used is that it's something that can be taken and tapered to different policy responses. So I think that's what's really important about the framework, and important about looking at one specific policy and one specific cohort of workers, because what may be the same, there might be similarities between the issues that disabled members are facing as low-paid women members generally, but sometimes it's worth looking at just one cohort of worker in sectors that they're working within, and this framework actually really helped to look at that. So one thing that came up that was a strategy that was being used was when wage gains were made. This really affected low-income women because of the taper rate and the way that the payment gets distributed in lump sums, or if there's any wage gain made and there's back pays, it affects the income of low paid women. And I guess sometimes you could think, well, this might just be a one-off thing and then eventually the wage gain would benefit them. But depending on the wage gain made and the long-term implications of that, it was still something that came up that was something that contradicted the intentions with the strategies that were being used and what actually happened for low-paid women, or the representation that low-paid women have gotten. And so it sort of goes on to the fourth finding where there were three sort of underutilised power resources that trade unions could sort of work on to better represent low-paid women. And I think the tables that go on kind of provide a better visual, demonstration of what I found. So the trade union interest in universal credit is that it has an effect on the structural power of workers, and this is largely because it undercuts the whole wage structure and the institutional power of trade unions to better negotiate working conditions. So there were three preferences that trade unions used that came out of the data. So the first one was to reduce low pay and a dependence on the welfare state through wage increases and income, and to protect the income of low paid workers. So some of the strategies might not have been a long-term fix, but when trade unions engaged in dialogue with employers, for example, they managed to mitigate some of the impact of a back payment that occurred and people losing income at that point in time. The second one was to resist the recommodification and regulation of working conditions imposed through universal credit. So obviously a lot of the campaigning that's been undertaken to stop sanctions is a form of that, and is a strategy that trade unions have been using to resist the recommodification of labour. And the last one was strategies put in place to strengthen trade union capacity to influence welfare reform. And this was trying to mobilise members or to build coalitions, and I think there's a very strong coalition with DPAC, for example, that the trade unions have. So on the last column, if we go back to the first preference, the things that kind of constrained trade union action, again, was the lack of political will from governments to engage in social dialogue, and this weak sort of social dialogue infrastructure that the UK has compared to maybe other countries where trade unions aren't part of policy making processes. But despite that, trade unions did deploy strategies of social dialogue, and most of the time through the research that I found was with employers rather than the state, because the unwillingness of the state didn't allow. They deployed strategies of industrial disputes and wage campaigns. And in the second preference, to resist, as I discussed, they also used social dialogue to engage with members, to engage with the state. And again, this formed part of industrial disputes and campaigns. They also formed coalitions with the likes of DPAC. But again, the constraints surrounding that were the lack of political will and an ineffective. Some of the strategies that were used included international work at the UN, and then the sort of ineffective legal mechanisms that work would translate into. The strategies deployed to strengthen the capacity was, again, the traditional ones of mobilising members. I think Fran spoke about taking things to Congress and having welfare put on the agenda in terms of passing motions. A lot of information giving for members around the policy, and also coalition building. But again, there was some quite significant political constraints on trade unions, where speaking out against the state inhibits their ability to mobilise, as well as legislative changes that took place and affected association rules that really had effect on trade unions. Just lastly, with this bang. But some recommendations that came out of the research that I think I've found particularly interesting and important. A lot of the sort of underutilisation of power resources has happened with ideational power, and it does speak to this kind of binary whether welfare is a hindrance to wage gains or is it a social security net? There's very much a binary still within the trade union movement about what it is internally and how we conceptualise it and how we think about it in terms of how it serves the labour market, the workforce, but also as a basic right, or is it a provision that we need only when times are tough, so to speak. So that was something that came out. There was a lot of gaps in data, or sort of particularly for the cohort of workers I was looking at, there was very limited data. It's very hard to get data from the government on this as well, so there's no surprise that trade unions might find that hard to have, but I believe personally as a researcher some really robust data on focusing on a certain cohort of worker, gathering how the policy affects them, why it affects them, and is an institutional strength. And give trade unions more institutional legitimacy as representative organisations. That was the biggest one. I think some coalition building with organisations that specifically work with low-paid women or that have information around low-paid women. Women's Budget Group, for one, might offer trade unions some insight, or there could be collaborations around data on that, because I know that's an organisation that does have solid data on low-paid women and women with caring responsibilities, for instance, which obviously trade unions know about, but maybe could gain some support or coalition with organisations like that. And even trade union representation of low-paid workers, that came out that perhaps there was a deterrent to join trade unions because sub-fees were high, and sort of trade union structures, trade union structures sometimes don't always represent low-paid workers, and this might be cause for low-paid workers not being as effectively represented within trade unions as they could be. And sometimes that's, a consequence of trade unions working within a market that's creating that kind of social stratum, and then the membership starts to sort of reflect the social stratum that's in the labour force. But it's definitely ideas to think about in terms of maybe some practical changes that could be made to better represent low-paid workers, but also give trade unions some institutional strength and legitimacy. Again, thank you. Sorry, it's very well.
Brilliant, thank you, Charlie. I think that really does give a good start to this panel session about some of not only the findings that you found there, Charlie, but actually some really interesting outcomes that sort of, especially with the interviews with trade unions and what the information that you found out there. And I know the work that you continue to do and will continue to do is going to be absolutely critical, working alongside all of our organisations in changing that narrative and actually finding out, digging deeper underneath the why unions think the way they do about social security. So thank you so much for that. Okay, I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Andy Mitchell. Andy is a member of Unite Community, but also a member of Disabled People Against the Cuts. Andy, I think most people in this room will know, is an absolute driving force behind our ongoing campaign for a better and fairer social security system. And Andy literally does, walk the walk. He doesn't just do the talk, and he literally lives and breathes this. And has also challenged the government and benefit system in court in recent times as well. He's a great friend to PCS. I'm proud to call him a comrade and a friend of mine, and he got me this t-shirt when he wanted. You can see Andy later on. Twice, yes, I lost his one. But seriously, Andy is an absolute stalwart of our movement, and as well, alongside others, it's not all about Andy, absolutely not, but alongside others, and it's fair to say that if it wasn't for Andy, we probably wouldn't be holding this event today. So Andy, over to you, mate.
Thanks everyone, and I should say that it isn't just me. I cannot do this work without the support of Unite Community, PCS and DPAC, and it's them that sort of drive me. So thank you to all of you. So for many years I have been saying that social security is a trade union issue. We're living in difficult times where too many people are struggling. We've gone from crisis to crisis while austerity cut the support needed to help get us out of it. Too many families are struggling to get through the month on the money they earn from work, so they have to rely on social security payments. The Resolution Foundation says there are 15 million people living in universal credit households, That's 8.5 million adults and 6.5 million children. 23% of the working age population get some form of social security. Almost 40% of universal credit claimants are working, and 1.3 million of them are now subject to conditionality and sanctions. Currently, 515,000 workers are in the most severe conditionality group and have to do intensive work search. Many of them are single parents, disabled, or from an ethnic minority. The majority are women. One of those people is a woman I met last year who works in a school and is contracted for 12 hours. But she often stays for much longer. She's also a single parent with 2 young children. She was moved from tax credits onto universal credit, and it was a shock to the system because she is now subjected to conditionality. Now, when she gets home and has finished cleaning the house, entertaining the children, feeding them, helping with homework, bathing them and putting them to bed, instead of relaxing with Corrie or EastEnders, she now has to look for work for hours each night. She told me it is causing real anxiety and often she cannot sleep. Sometimes she goes to work feeling like a zombie. She's tried to raise it with her work coach, but they never seem to have time to discuss it properly. Her anxiety is affecting the behaviour of her children, and she's had to have days off work. Poor mental health is something trade unions know can have a real detrimental impact on the family and on the health and safety of a workplace. So why are we not doing more to support them? Last year saw the biggest attack on disabled people we've seen from a government in years, but some unions did nothing. There were notable exceptions, of course: PCS, Unite, Unison, Equity, to name but a few. Their role in supporting their campaign work that DPAC were doing and other DPOs, writing briefings and speaking to MPs, was vitally important. Imagine, though, if the whole trade union movement had been as vocal. If the TUC had followed its policy and created a task force, as stated in one of the social security motions that went to Congress in 2024, it could have meant an even bigger win than the climb down we saw for PIP. There are so many social security related issues that trade unions and the TUC could be tackling. For example, access to work, where we are seeing huge backlogs of up to 9 months and massive cuts to grants for disabled workers at renewal stage. Some of them have been forced to stop paying personal assistants and support workers. Others have had to give up work entirely. There never seems to be a moment where disabled people are not fighting some aspect of the DWP just so we can live a dignified and independent life. Even before the TIMS review, I thought trade unions should be looking at personal independence payment. The system does need changing, and the Commission on Social Security has completed a project with alternative ideas. But as it is, there are 3.9 million people getting PIP and 1 in 8 of them are working. However, as a group, working people are far less likely to get an award after an assessment. PIP isn't an in-work benefit, but it is part of the support that can keep people in employment. So I think trade unions should be asking why it is much more difficult to convince an assessor to get a PIP award if you're in a job. We've heard a lot in recent weeks about young people who are not in employment, education or training. I'm not going to get into the Milburn review, but it is a really important issue. However, his reliance on benefit sanctions and belief that PIP should help young people into work is not the right approach, and we should be resisting it. They need to remove barriers that have been in place for years, such as the apprenticeship penalty, where young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are abandoning valuable training opportunities because it can leave their families out of pocket by as much as £340 a week, according to the Social Security Advisory Committee. The problem is caused by benefit rules that classify a 16-year-old apprentice as an independent worker who no longer requires parental support. As a result, the parent's child benefit and child and disability elements of universal credit are withdrawn. By contrast, the family of a 16-year-old who is in full-time education until 18 would see no reduction in benefit income, even if their child works part-time, as the child is regarded by the benefit system as a qualified young person. Apprentices are extremely important to the future of trade unions, so we need to be removing the barriers that are causing these young people to drop out. Let's turn to a subject I wish I wasn't constantly revisiting. Over 630,000 benefit sanctions have been handed out to just under 500,000 people in the last year. Universal credit sanction numbers have risen since Labour took power, according to DWP figures. In 2024, Citizens Advice said 20% of the people they see for advice on sanctions were from people in employment. The Public Law Project reports that the average cost of a sanction is currently £524. The median length of a sanction is 5 weeks. By comparison, the average criminal court fine issued in 2024 is £283, which, unlike sanctions, can be paid in instalments. As Angela and Martin said in the Work and Pension Select Committee last year, the impact of sanctions severely hampers your ability to look for work. The stress affects your cognitive abilities and affects sleep, making it harder to effectively search and apply for jobs. Sanctions cause debt and hardship, resulting in rent arrears, energy debt, and the need to go to food banks. It impacts on both your mental and physical health. And if you have dependents, it can cause them harm too. It used to be that the unemployed who were the only ones who were affected. But now, as Charlene mentioned earlier, more and more low-paid workers are being punished too. A couple of years ago, some of us in this room were privileged to be among a group of people who went to Geneva to speak to the UN about disability benefit cuts and social security. While there, we met 2 grieving families of people who had died following cuts to benefits. This week, we learnt about David Panther, who took his own life after moving from working tax credits to universal credit. After migration, his social care costs went up from £0 to £129 a week. David, who worked part-time teaching people to juggle and who was a member of the union Equity, could not cope and suddenly died at the end of January. The terrible thing is, like so many other benefit deaths, this could have been easily prevented. With so many working families now relying on benefits, with many others unable to get decent, secure housing, and many more struggling with debt, with disabled people constantly being attacked, and with the jobs market being so insecure, it has never been more important for trade unions to work together to tackle these issues. The coalition that PCS, DPAC and Unite Community has formed over the last few years needs to grow to include more trade unions and campaign organisations. We need to learn from projects like the Commission on Social Security that Ellen is involved in. We also need to learn from academics such as Charlene. That way, we don't need to be constantly on the back foot fighting against policy. We can be shaping it too. I think I better stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, some really important data and stats there, but also a human story at the end in terms of the real cost of social security when it goes badly wrong. And we have these discussions all the time, don't we, about is social security a safety net? Is it something that is there to help and support people? Well, more clearly, if actually the social security system is being directly responsible for people either taking their own lives or other deaths, then I think that really does give the most harrowing of examples of how badly can go wrong, or why it is something that we cannot just let go, why this campaign is so important. So thank you very much for that, Andy. Okay, we're going to move on now to our third speaker. It's Ellen Morrison-Smith. Ellen is on the National Steering Group of the Disabled People Against the Cuts, But as Andy just mentioned, Ellen also works with the Commission on Social Security, which is a user-led project that co-produces alternative policies for an improved social security system, and importantly, it's designed by people who rely on them. We've been privileged to share many a platform with Ellen, and she, again, like Andy, is a fantastic campaigner and advocate for this campaign, but also for why we need an improved and better social security system. So, Ellen, over to you.
Thanks very much. So yeah, as Martin said, I'm Ellen Morrison-Smith. I'm on the National Steering Group of Disabled People Against Cuts. I'm also part of the Commission on Social Security, but I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. And just to echo what Martin said, really, I think it's a really positive thing that we're all here today discussing social security, particularly when the overwhelming narrative right now is, well, from politicians and the media, that it's us and them. It's the workers versus the work shy. It's the people who graft versus the benefits scroungers. But I think we know that the us and them that we need to worry about is all of us here in this room versus the people who want to keep us divided. So really today I just wanted to start by talking about the situation that we find ourselves in and what happens when the reality of a broken and punitive system meets the reality of our lives. And just to warn anyone, I will mention David Panther again, and just a little trigger warning that is about suicide. And I know Andy just mentioned him, but I think it's really important to speak about him again. So just to say, David Panther was from Sheffield, and this week the story of his life was shared on Disability News Service. And I know that most people are going to be familiar with the Disability News Service, but for anyone who isn't, it's such a valuable resource for all of us in terms of covering not only disabled people's lives, but also social security policy. And just to say, David was an autistic man, a circus skills teacher, someone who relied on social care to support him and live with dignity. But after he moved on to universal credit, the way his income was calculated changed. And so then he was faced with a new charge of £500 a month towards his care package. He wanted answers on this, he wanted this to be explained to him. Ultimately, what he was looking for most of all was an invoice, so he could see what his debts were and how to clear it. He'd repeatedly tried to get this. He'd worked with his trade union, Equity. He'd also been in touch with DPAC, but unfortunately, constant delays, prevarication, he didn't get any answers, and that stress just mounted up. And I think it really can't be understated that someone like that who faces that uncertainty with bureaucratic processes is very difficult to deal with. And just to say really, social security payments, although the government likes to see it as just this one area, it doesn't sit in isolation from the rest of the system and how it works, and that's how we can see something like social care then impacting on his income and social security. And it was that process of migrating to universal credit that created those knock-on consequences on his income, his finances, social care charges, and then ultimately his mental health. And David is obviously not the only one who has lost his life at the hands of social security policies, and sadly won't be the last. But just to move on now to talk about fighting back and how we can think about changing the system. I'm here on behalf of DPAC, which started back in 2010 at a protest at Tory conference, and it was part of the many groups that formed the national anti-austerity movement. And although I wasn't involved back in 2010, I know, like the early days, like now, it's an increasingly worrying time to be a disabled person. In 2010, we had the new Tory government, which had begun an all-out assault on the welfare state, and it was very easy to feel isolated. Obviously, like now, social security claimants demonised as scroungers, as well as having our right to an independent life subject to the failed work capability assessment by outsourced contractors like Atos. And it was in that context that DPAC members saw the need to organise and to fight back. And one of the first alliances that DPAC made were with the very people being forced to implement that agenda, the DWP workers represented by PCS. And that relationship between DPAC and PCS is one that endured through 14 years of Tory rule, and together we worked to curb some of their worst excesses, to turn austerity into a dirty word in politics and make disabled people's demands a core part of the Labour movement agenda. So that's the first point I really want to make, which is that solidarity is real. It's meant that we as disabled people and social security claimants could see that we had far more in common than these workers who are being made to cut our benefits, than the political and media elites who are condemning us. And it meant those workers saw us in turn as their comrades, despite a work environment where they could have been incentivised to see us as less than. And then it meant when they stood up for decent pay, terms and conditions, we were right there alongside them. And of course we know that many in PCS face the same battles with PIP, low wages, universal credits, those same battles that we do. So secondly, I want to talk about the change that we need to see. We've spent a lot of time as a movement, as disabled people and trade unionists, talking about the problems that we have with social security, very understandably. But I want to talk about a project that I'm part of, the Commission on Social Security, and we're working together to think about what is it that we can come up with that would be a better system. And we started in 2018. We're a user-led project designed with the aim of shaping policies for a better social security system, and all of it is designed by people who rely on the social security system. Everyone involved in our steering group is either a current or a recent social security claimant. And it just happened that our most recent piece of work has been to design an alternative to personal independence payment, long before it was announced that the government would launch their own review into it. And our work has really come from the perspective that PIP can really be a lifeline to people, but when it works. And unfortunately at the moment the current system just causes a lot of harm and distress unnecessarily. And although it's obviously, I know as other speakers have mentioned, it is unrelated to someone's work status, it can mean that when that support's in place, disabled people are able to stay and work or even consider entering work if that's appropriate. So we had some ideas for an initial proposal on a replacement to PIP, an additional cost disability payment, and that went out to a large-scale consultation last year, and we had over 5,000 responses to that. And that led to a final proposal that we published in September in Parliament. And the Commission was honoured to have Martin and Angela join us at the launch of that. And I know as well that PCS had done invaluable work themselves on social security with their... Sorry, Andy was also there. Because I feel like he wants you to know, so everyone, Andy was there. But yeah, I was just mentioning PCS's own publication, Social Security, There is an Alternative, which again sets out an approach for genuine reform and resourcing of the social security. So I won't go into detail of the additional cost disability payment, the Commission's proposal, but it's available on our website. You can come find me if you're having trouble finding it, if you want to read more. But in a nutshell, our proposal, you would be encouraged and not condemned for applying. You'd get the money that you need to face the real additional costs that disabled people face. And really, we think you can't reform PIP without truly acknowledging the extra costs, the extra support that disabled people need elsewhere, like with schemes through access to work. So you can't just look at it in a silo on its own. It has to be part of a bigger picture. And obviously we don't expect PCS, every trade union, every disabled people's organisation to adopt every single part of our proposal, but really it's just about building a coalition of support for a proposal that wants to see a genuine overhaul of the social security system. We're obviously not getting that from the government at present. The most we have right now is the TIMS review, and I think a lot of us aren't convinced that that's going to be the genuine level of co-production that we need to see from the social security system. We're also not convinced that savings at any cost is not the goal that the government have in mind at the moment. And they may have dressed it up in the language of co-production, but really we doubt whether they're putting disabled people at the centre of policy making. And I think even the biggest optimists know better than to proceed without caution when it comes to the DWP. Just takes me on to why today is so essential. Obviously, a few talking heads in a room isn't going to change the world or the social security system, but I think the conversations with each other, the workshops this afternoon, I think it all gives us a chance to keep building our coalitions and coming round common goals that we can call for. And where the government choose to see the social security system in isolation, we keep up the pressure so that our lives are seen in the round, so that we can prevent more lives lost to bureaucratic failures like we saw with David Panther. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ellen, and a really important point there about as well. It's not just about saying how bad things are and concentrating on that. Whilst it is important to get that message out, it's also vital that we actually produce our own alternative visions for a better social security and fairer social security. So absolutely fantastic. Comrades, I should have mentioned earlier on, just let people know that there are some photographers in the room, and they will be taking pictures during the day. This session and the earlier session when Fran spoke is being filmed as well, but no other sessions are being filmed. But if people don't want their photograph taken, if they let themselves know to Sam, who's going to be standing up there at the back, who's going to be taking pictures during the day, and is there any other photographers in the room that I don't know about? And if so, why are you here? Then obviously if you don't want your picture taken, just let Sam know and he'll respect that. Okay, cheers, comrades. Okay, it gives me great pleasure then. Finally, last but by no means least, I want to introduce a great friend and comrade, Angela Grant, who is the DWP Group President for Public and Commercial Services Union, PCS. Angela is not only a great advocate for our union, but a great advocate for this campaign. And as long as I've known Angela, Angela's always understood the importance of not just working and fighting tirelessly for workers' rights and improving, what happens to our members within the workplace, but absolutely has always understood that it's important to look beyond that as well and look at what services, how we provide them, and what sort of the respect and dignity that our members should be able to provide for those who are using the social security system. And we couldn't have a better advocate, as Angela Grant on that issue. So Angela, to you.
Thanks everyone, and I just want to reiterate the thanks to Deepak and to Unite for the work that you have been doing, to Andy, to Ellen with the Commission. The work you've been, it's absolutely fantastic. It's outstanding, groundbreaking work that you are doing, and Charlene for the work that you are doing also. And this is what trade unions do, and this is what community groups do. We are the driving force, and it is right that we should be pushing government. And I want to shout out to Brett at the back as well, because I don't think you've been mentioned, but thanks to Brett, because you have been, again, a really good friend to PCS and a real driving force in all of this. Since the austerity began and we saw, the attacks on disabled people, the attacks on our class, and it is a class attack, and we see the attacks on anybody that has a protected characteristic, that sits under the Equality Act, that is considered that they need support and they need recognition and that dignity that Martin spoke about just then. That is our battle. Our battle is for dignity, to be treated with dignity and respect, and everybody sitting at this table, and Martin included, and our PCS workers that have helped to do this today. I think it's fantastic that we have actually got this off the ground. It's been a long time coming, as Fran said, and others, since 2015. And just to say what happened in 2015, what came from that, and the biggest thing for me out of that is when we created the 12 steps against sanction to stop sanctions being implemented. We did that as joint working with PCS and Deepak and Unite Community. We did that work. And it helped us. You will find that where PCS is strong in the DWP, where PCS is strong, sanctions are minimal, because our workers come to us and they do not want to sanction people. We come to DWP because we want to do a good job for our communities. We want to support. We want to give money at the point of need. That's what it is for us. It's about giving that financial support at the point of need. But DWP now have switched from where the beverage port and everything else, you know, when we knew that this was about supporting communities. DWP now run this as a business. They don't call it a service, they call it a business, and we have arguments over the table just over those words. Sometimes it's not a business, you don't have the profit and loss sheets. You are here to serve the community, you are servants of the public, and we do have those debates, you know, across the table, but we want to see that, you know, support at the point of need. We want to see the return of a proper social fund, you know, for communities that can't afford to buy a bed for their children. And when you look at the disabled community, disabled people that want to work, more often than not, people want to work. Nobody just sits at home just because they want to watch daytime TV, as you sometimes see in the press. Most people want to go out to work. And when we look at PIP and those that if you have PIP and you get a bit of mobility allowance, and it's not a lot, but that money doesn't just help that person to survive and to go to work. And those that cannot work, it puts money into the economy, and that's something that government just will not understand. No matter how many times we push to them, we tell them, if you want to fix your economy, you want to grow your economy, put money in people's pockets, look after your communities, and if we can do that for disabled people, it will give them the ability to get into work where they can. That in itself helps your mental health. That in itself, it puts food in it. I mean, how many people have been found dead with no food in their bellies because of a sanction? And we say this to our employer, and what we get is, oh, well, actually, you know, well, no, it's not, well, actually, you know, you cannot justify people dying when you are not providing money for them to eat. Sanctions, it is the most barbaric policy ever. How can you take away money from somebody that is living on the poverty line already? Because benefits, they don't benefit anybody. It is a poverty payment. It is just to keep you just above the poverty line, and it doesn't even do that. So to take that money away, what? So what's somebody supposed to live on? That's why we're seeing homeless people on the street. The majority of people that are homeless have been sanctioned. How is that helping the economy? How is that helping government? It's not. So once they come to understand that if they support people with money, the economy will grow, and we won't see all these shops closing on the street. We will see a better standard of living for all, but they will not do that. So we have got our Alternative to Social Security, PCS. We've also got our Tax Justice campaign, so that we can see people being taxed and that money coming into proper social security. I want to touch, and I hadn't realised that you work in the criminal justice system. I just want to touch on that, because when we see what's happening with the cuts to benefit, and they're still cutting the youth payments, so we know that we will have young people that have serious mental health conditions or whatever conditions they may have, they need a health payment. When they don't get that, we know that people will be presenting at the job centre. We know DWP are trying to cut security guards, and we are seeing people, young people and older people, turning up at a job centre in total frustration, and that frustration presents as anger. I mean, people say to me, "Are you kicking off?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not. That's just how I speak. I think it's coming out with lambs in the field and all flowers, and it's not. I'm coming out like that." But so I do it. I took my son in when he'd been sanctioned, and they brought security. I'm like, "You're all right, mate. I'm staff. You don't need to make security for me. I work at DWP." But he'd been sanctioned, and he didn't even know. He just went to the bank one day, didn't know why. He hadn't had an appointment planned. So when you go in and you present, and they call security, that is a flashpoint for any person that is already in struggle. That security guard, presenting like a police officer in a uniform, that is a flashpoint. And we are starting to see people criminalised. And I did a little bit of criminal justice study, and my dissertation was about how society creates criminals, because we push people into places where they need to respond. And they have to go shoplifting. Why do people have to go? Why are people having to steal nappies and baby milk? We are living in 2026, one of the richest economies in the world, and they are starving people into that place where they have to break the law. But it's morally, they're not breaking the law. Legally, they are under legislation, but morally, we should still have free baby milk and free fruit and free milk for children. So when we are seeing that presentation at the job centre, it will be disabled people that are being criminalised. And if government don't understand that, we have to make them understand that. And that's why our working together and our creating those policies and pushing those policies to them will help. It does help. We've seen where we've pushed back on some of the worst parts, but we haven't done it all. And anybody else that comes to PIP later, new claimants will still be facing really austere and stricter rules for PIP. We have to future-proof it. We don't have to just do it for us now, we have to future-proof it. So anybody that comes after, we have to leave services better than we found them. Every time I speak about services, I say it to my children, to anybody. When we come in, we are custodians of the services that we have. We cannot leave them worse. We cannot allow them on our watch to be worse than when we came. So we have to make sure we fix that. Just to talk about the ministers again, I wrote down when you said a few times, Charlene, the lack of political will. Lack of political will. We are DWP, we are government workers in PCS, obviously. Now, we have been trying to meet with the minister. When the Labour government came in, we had a minister, we were told that there was a new minister for transformation, and we were like, why, what are you transforming? What do you mean? Well, we're transforming the DWP. Oh yeah? Without any consultation with the union, you haven't told us about that. So we demanded a meeting with the minister, and we got it. We didn't get it with it was Liz Kendall at the time. Didn't get to meet with her, but we got a meeting with Andrew Weston, who was the Minister for Transformation. And that was when the Labour Party first came to government. We were supposed to have 2 meetings a year. He promised that over their 5 years. We'd have 2 meetings a year. We've only ever had that one. We are still waiting for a meeting with the minister. Now, when we talk about the need for decent services, and we need, you need decent pay, don't you? You have to. If you're not paid well, your mental health struggles. So how can you do a job when your mental health is struggling? And again, Disability News did a good piece for us on the crisis, the mental health crisis in the DWP, and how lots of our members are actually claiming disability benefits themselves. So we're constantly trying to get meetings with the ministers, and we haven't, but we've just come across something that's happened this week again with no consultation. DWP say there has been consultation. There has not been consultation for us to be able to go out and speak to our members. They've embargoed lots of information that they've given us. But they have just now actually presented to our members a voluntary exit scheme, and there are 279 workers that are about to be voluntarily exited from the DWP. That is a precursor to redundancy. Now, while they are trying to get 700,000 economically inactive, and that means sick and disabled people, trying to get them into work because they must work, because they don't want people sitting at home, while they're doing that, they are jettisoning their own staff and putting their own staff on the benefit books, because redundancy pay doesn't last a minute. Now, they've not mentioned any redundancies yet, but that voluntary exit will mean cuts to services, and it will mean that our members are going to be put out to pasture. What an absolute disgrace to lose all of that experience from the DWP at a time when we're in transition and we need staff at the desk. We need empowerment for our work coaches. Work coaches do not have the right to sit and have an interview. They don't have a right to sit. They're doing 10-minute interviews, and it is a conveyor belt. They're working through their lunch and they're working after work to make sure that they are clearing their workload. Huge backlogs in PIP. So we are not getting the payments out to those that need it, and yet they think that they can get rid of the staff while they are paying millions of pounds of overtime. So the work is costing double from the public purse. It's an absolute shambles, and we can tell you more. Anything you need to know, give us a shout. We are going to try and do some reporting on what's happening at the minute in DWP. I just want to quickly talk about OnlyFans, because this is a huge issue for us at the moment. Now, somebody put something out while we were at our conference. There was an article that went out that said that the DWP GC hates sex workers. That is not the truth. Of course, we support all workers. That is what we're here for. We're trade unionists. We support all workers. But the DWP, we have found, and it was when Andy and myself had spoken a couple of years ago, we found, I think probably a year ago, we found that work coaches, in their training, were being told to offer OnlyFans to people that were coming through the DWP doors. Now, if somebody wants to be on OnlyFans, that's their right. Of course it is, if that's what they want to do. But we know that there are links to sex work. OnlyFans will link to, not always, but links to sex work. Now you can have cooking programs. You can. Some people show their feet on OnlyFans, so it doesn't have to be anything, anything really bad. But can you imagine if somebody, young person that has a mental health condition, walks through the doors of the DWP, and that work coach has to say to that person, you could try OnlyFans. Do you want to think about doing OnlyFans, get yourself online? And then that person is subject to conditionality. And they're saying, you've only done 12 hours of OnlyFans, why have you not done more? And you're not earning enough, you might need to up your game a little bit. Can you imagine what that will mean to a person, a young person? Can you imagine what it might mean for an older person, not to be ageist? OnlyFans is not something that DWP should be presenting as work. If somebody works in OnlyFans and wants to, and they declare that and it's taxed, then that's fair enough and they can do that. But we will not have DWP offering those kinds of jobs and saying that is good, solid, sustainable employment. It's not. There are jobs out there. And also they're pushing AI as work. Not everybody, I'm Daniel Blake, not everybody is digital by default. And some young people might want to be plumbers and bricklayers, and why are we not? Where is that work? Where is it? There isn't any. And DWP, they would rather look at the easy option of OnlyFans than actually look at proper, sustainable work. So, I suppose my point is that we go right across the board. So we're going from the ministers to young people that are coming into work, and all of it, the majority of the work that we do is actually around disability now, because the mental health crisis, both within our workplace and with the workplace, is absolutely astounding when you look at the numbers. I'm not going to give you facts and figures because we've heard a lot of facts and figures now, but I'm just going to finish on the fact that every one of us in this room, we are the wave of change that is to come. It is us that will affect that change, and every one of us has to go out, and we have to be in our communities, and we have to be pushing our MPs. We have to be doing every single thing we can to turn the tide before we end up with a reform government. Because we are seeing the far right, we are seeing them pushing their rhetoric. We are seeing that they want to remove the Equality Act. You know, a young man was stabbed to death. That's how we won the Equality Act. And it's not perfect, but it has saved us for many, many years now. And we have to make sure that we keep the Equality Act and we build on it rather than have it reduced. If we end up with a reform or restore government, we are all of us dead in the water. We will have nowhere to go. So we have to push now before we end up with that. And I'll finish on that. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Anne, for giving hopefully what people find an insight into, if you like, from a DWP worker perspective, from a PCS member perspective, as to some of the challenges that we face, and they really are not in any way, shape or form dissimilar to those on the other side of the counter. We've been saying now for a number of years that our members are now experienced in DWP on both sides of the desk, more and more, and that is something that I think Andrew's brought out there. I'm really bad sharing, so we actually have really ran out of the entire time, and we haven't got any time for questions, but I'm going to speak to the organisers to see if we can rejig the agenda slightly this afternoon so we can get some questions, because there are some questions that I think do deserve an airing and answering that have been sent in, and obviously the whole point of this is to hear from you and participate with you as well. So I think we'll be able to shave some time off this afternoon, but equally I don't want to cut too much time off the workshop, so we'll see what can be done. So, comrades, we are going to take a few questions out. We've been given 10 minutes. Excellent. So I'm going to try, we clearly can't get through them all, but I'm going to sort of handpick a few of the questions. The first one, I think, is an important one. It builds on what we've been discussing, and it is, does the panel agree that unions should be supporting outreach organisations that are offering support and services to people claiming benefits? And that's from Clara, from Unite, and I'm going to ask Ellen to start.
Thanks. So, in terms of unions supporting organisations that offer support and services to people claiming benefits, obviously that would be a yes from me. And I think in terms of specifically Unite Community, the work that Unite Community does at the moment, embedding itself in lots of different groups, plays a vital role in that. And I can't really state enough, I think, the importance of of Unite community within the union and the role that it serves. But I do think that unions should be, in general, central to supporting people claiming benefits. I mean, the whole point of today, social security is a trade union issue. We've just heard the amount of PCS workers that are on social security themselves. So I think it's a really fundamental part of trade unions in the world that we live in at the moment, when so many people are facing low pay that has to be topped up with universal credit. I'll hand over.
Thanks, Martin. I totally agree with what Helen's just said there. When I've been at Congress, I was at Women's TUC a couple of months ago, and Paul Novak was there, so he's now the head of the TUC, and I asked Paul Novak the question, and that was, why are the trade unions, why is the TUC not supporting outreach, welfare advice on the high street? You used to be able to go into solicitors' offices, you used to go anywhere. I mean, CAB lost its funding, I think they get a little bit now. You know, all the places where we would normally go for support, they are shut down. So I certainly do believe that the trade unions should be supporting outreach. I think there should be a social security advice centre on every high street. If you've got a job centre, why isn't there somebody in that job centre to give you welfare advice? Why? Because they don't want you to claim welfare. That's why the Tories shut it all down, and that's why the Labour Party should be doing what they were built for, and putting money back in people's pockets and putting that support back out there. So yeah, I definitely do, but I think we should be working on the TUC to get those welfare advice centres on the high street.
I'm going to come to Charlene and Andy on this one. It's how can we create the necessary will to action, including direct action, amongst disabled people and their allies to use the methods that got us our wins, and that's from James from Unite Social.
I'll speak from the perspective of my research, but I absolutely think that the wins that you've had from what I found in the research was definitely through coalition building. Campaigning, obviously, you've stated the wins that you've had yourself. But my future hopes is to build and bridge a greater connection between academia, but research and trade unionism. And I feel like for a long time trade unions have been putting out fires because they've been under attack, and they're just band-aiding, not deliberately, but because they, and I think institutional strength can come from coalition building, but giving us little academics who like doing our research, but giving some of the load off to other institutions that can create support. And I very much am looking into that myself going forward, how I can work to bridge the gap between research, because I did feel within my research there was a lot of gaps in data around the people that I was looking at. And I think in terms of legitimacy and how trade unions get treated more legitimately as industrial actors, I do think institutionally, if you've got really robust research, you've got really strategic aims that also align up with other, I know Dave and I were talking before, economic policies, and you've got strategies and alternatives that appeal or translate, and you can make cross-class alliances with Brett has also been very good at doing, like going to Parliament and creating alliances with politicians. I think within my research that's where I've seen that you've had wins and will. And also take some of the load off disabled people as well, even though I think that it's really important that they're part of the activism. That there's institutions and organisations that can take some of the stress and burden off them in the cause, I guess.
Can I just quickly say something on this as well, just really, really quickly? I think we also have to keep fighting for the right to protest as well, because a lot of people are losing confidence because they feel that if they don't chain themselves to a rail, and then they will be arrested. So we've got to make sure we're fighting against the lack of that, the loss of that.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say that last year, a lot of the things that the government were proposing, people didn't understand. So part of the role of people like myself and Deepak and the trade unions was to actually explain the issues to people so that they could be properly briefed to properly understand. Also, you know, people wanted to organise locally. It was immensely helpful to them that we could provide some of the resources, the leaflets, the banners, the things like that, for that, to enable them to be able to go out and doing those things. To help with things like sending an email to your MP. You know, people didn't know what to say, so being able to help them with ideas, suggestions, you know, allow people to be able to organise those things themselves. The same with social media. You know, people don't always know what to write. You know, they don't want to make a fool of themselves. So if we can help them to some degree with that, you know, making suggestions, then, you know, last year we saw this absolute surge of people, not just disabled people, but people that were so angry. And what we were able to put things in place to make their campaigning easier, and you saw the results of it with the government climbing down. I was so glad that I was part of that we could create those leaflets, that we could create those events, help to create those events. You know, nationally, DPAC and others organised. Locally, you know, we provided resources and support where necessary. We also, DPAC also doesn't have a lot of money, but sometimes we were able to provide a little bit of funding so people could travel to get to events. That's, I think, the sort of practical way in which we can help.
I'll just very quickly come in on that as well. I think part of the question is about how we encourage direct action, and it's so important, obviously. I mean, that's what DPAC's all about. It's our history, it's direct action, it's getting involved in things. It's, if you ask nicely, you're not going to get what you want most of the time. But I think in terms of driving involvement into direct action, I think last year we really saw it was meeting people where they're at. And so it's not going to be for everyone to go and do something in person, and that's really important to remember. And sorry to very briefly go on a tangent, but if anyone was aware, there was an exhibition at the V&A called Design and Disability. And in that they had a little bit of information on DPAC, including an online protest tool that DPAC was involved in developing. And the whole point of that is to bring protest to everyone, wherever they are, whether or not they can make it out onto a picket line or a protest or wherever it might be. And Andy mentioned some of the meetings, and unfortunately at some point I've been mislabeled as being young within DPAC, so I'm responsible for the tech. So that means that when I have helped run these Zoom meetings, I get to see just how many people are joining these Zoom meetings. And last year, Meg's nodding because Meg is also labelled as young, but she's actually genuinely young. She doesn't just have a round face like me. And we saw hundreds of people joining last year, and that was because from all across the country people can join in on Zoom, and then they can get briefed and they can learn more information, and then they can feel a bit more confident about turning up to something that they may never have been to something like that before. So, and just to also say, I think the alliances that Charlene mentioned are really, really important. So DPAC is really well placed for direct action and for protest. People expect that of us. But then we work with the trade unions, who might not be the angry ones at the front, but we all work together and we all play our part in that. So yeah, not very coherent, but thanks for letting me come in.
Thanks very much, Ellen. I mean, we probably have run out of the extra 10 minutes now. I will still see if we can get more time this afternoon, because there are some questions. I know you're doing like that, but we'll find some time this afternoon, I'm sure we will. So we are going to break for lunch now, comrades. Just before we do, let you know that lunch is being served in G06-7 room on the ground floor. It's taking place now from where we finish to 1:15, which is when the workshop starts. In terms of the workshops, and then the groups are listed on the wall near the back of the room. and also with the room location on the doors as well, and staff also have copies, so if the staff can make themselves known to you as you're leaving, if people aren't sure what workshop they're in, then have a look at that. Everyone has been given either their first or second, or first and second preferences, should I say. So you've all been asked to put 2 preferences down. You have been given your first and second preferences, but depending on what order they're in, just check on that list. If your name is not down on a workshop, then feel free to choose any of the workshops, but you're going to go to 2. Okay. So the workshops will take place 1:15. So we'll break now for lunch, and we'll see what we can do to get more questions in this afternoon. Cheers all. Enjoy your lunch.